Okay, folks, another Student Scholar Day is very exciting. It's my pleasure to introduce Tucker Jones. Tucker just recently got accepted to graduate school, a doctoral program with a guaranteed full ride for 5 years, teaching assistantship. It's very impressive, not a lot of those around these days with the current economy, and very well deserved. As you'll see, Tucker's study here is a very impressive one. I think it's well worth actually a master's thesis if you were to write up the entire thesis document in that style. It is his senior thesis. Most exciting of all is the data. The data is unbelievable. This is one of the coolest data sets I've ever seen in all my research. There's so much here that he'll give you an overview, and that's about it. So welcome, Tucker.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So like Dr. Ellison said, my name is Tucker Jones, and I'm here today to talk to you about my research titled Coping with Rejection-Induced Emotions and Shame. So in his book, Philosophies of Psychology, William James once said that there's no more fiendish a punishment could be devised were such a thing physically possible that one should be turned loose in society and remain absolutely unnoticed by all members. A kind of rage and impotent despair would ere long well up in us, from which the cruelest bodily tortures would be relief. So what he's saying here is that rejection is a very powerful emotion. It's very painful for us, and if we were to be completely cast away from society and nobody talked to us, it'd almost be preferable to be tortured just because we'd still have some human interaction. So the purpose of my project here was to explore hypothesized coping methods for rejection-induced feelings of shame over time, as well as to further assess the validity of the composite shame scale, or the CoSS. For a little background on rejection, Leary said that when faced with feelings of exclusion, humans do whatever we can to make amends and repair the bonds that may have been damaged or broken over time. So this is believed to have an evolutionary explanation. For our ancestors, survival pretty much depended on inclusion within a group. And along with group membership, we also see things like status, resources, and mate selection were also more available. So if one was to be excluded by their social group long ago, the odds of them being able to find resources to protect themselves against the wild, protect themselves from other tribes, was very low, and their chance of survival was also very low. So being included within a social group can be emotionally comforting. As Dr. Kelso likes to say, it's those warm, fuzzy feelings we get. However, being rejected from a social group can be emotionally devastating. If you remember middle school, being rejected by your peer groups was terrifying. You didn't want that to happen. It was a very painful situation to go through. And so this is why it's believed to be evolutionarily adaptive to fear being rejected, to fear having that happen to us. So how do we monitor rejection? Well, Leary and colleagues came up with the sociometer, which is kind of like a social fuel gauge. As you can see here, the way he set it up is if you have high self-esteem, the probability of experiencing the rejection is very low. However, if you have low self-esteem, the probability of experiencing rejection is very high. So if you think that about your daily fuel gauge, and it's about somewhere in the middle, if you're rejected, it may drop significantly, or if you're accepted, it may go up significantly. You may feel better or worse about yourself, depending on what you experience. And so Leary called this sense of, when your fuel gauge drops, a sense of personal devaluation. This is a belief that people no longer like you as a person, which is it's kind of sad to think about, you know. Instead of being like, well, they don't like my friendship, no, they don't like me as a person. That's a very powerful reaction to rejection. So responses to rejection, there's a wide variety, ranging from anxiety, hurt feelings, anger, loneliness, behavioral and psychological pathology, and there's shame as well. And it's also important to note that the basic emotion of shame can be viewed as a family that includes most of these reactions, and it's also been correlated with several of these. So a little bit with shame and rejection. Chef said that due to our social nature, we expose ourselves to being rejected each and every day. Whether it's going to the grocery store or going to class, whatever we do, we're typically in a social setting. And because we're in that social setting, we take the chance of being rejected. So this tends to lead to painful feelings of embarrassment, humiliation, and of course shame. So coping with shame, Nathanson came up with the compass of shame. With it as the 4 poles of withdrawal, avoidance, attack other, and attack self. To go into those a little bit more in depth, attack self is the internalizing feelings of anger and blame. Sayings like, I'm stupid, this is all my fault. If you think about a good student who gets a C on a test, they may internalize and say, this is my fault, I'm a failure, I'm a bad student. You know, they internalize those feelings. Withdrawal is the tendency to hide or withdraw when shamed. It's internalization of one's failures, but leaving the situation instead of trying to make amends in order to alleviate these feelings of shame. A good example is if you were at a party or you or someone you know says something distasteful, instead of apologizing and trying to make amends, they just leave the party altogether. So that would be an example of withdrawal. Attack other is the opposite of attack self, and it's the tendency to externalize feelings of anger or blame. Sayings like, you're stupid, this is all your fault. If you go back to the student example, if they do poorly on a test, they may not blame themselves. Instead, they may externalize that blame and say, this is all the teacher's fault. They have it out for me. They don't know what they're doing. It's that externalizing process of these feelings of blame. Avoidance is the tendency to minimize the importance of a shameful situation. Things like, it doesn't really matter, I don't care, you know, just blowing it off really easily. If you go back to the example of saying something distasteful at a party, instead of taking yourself out of that situation, you're more likely to laugh it off and just change the subject instead of actually dealing with the initial problem. So this led to the development of the Compass of Shame scale. It's composed of 4 subscales, each represent one of the methods of shame coping. So as you can see here, attack self, withdrawal, attack other, and avoidance are all of these subscales in the Compass of Shame scale. So it was developed by Dr. Ellison and colleagues in 2006. It's made up of 12 scenarios with 4 responses each, giving it a total of 48 items, plus an additional 10 items that measure adaptive coping. An example of this could be, when an activity makes me feel like my strength or skill is inferior, I, 1, don't let it bother me, which would be avoidance. I get mad at myself for not being good enough, which would be attack self. I withdraw from the activity, which of course would be withdrawal. And I get irritated with other people, which would be attack other. And this is rated on a frequency of use, with 1 being never and 5 being almost always. So for the present study, we wanted to experimentally manipulate feelings of inclusion versus exclusion, as well as to assess changes in coping over time. So our hypotheses were that our exclusion group will score significantly higher on attack self and withdrawal. They'd be more likely to internalize. And after given a few days to cope, participants will score significantly higher on the cost on attack other and avoidance at time 2, suggesting that coping has occurred over time. So to kind of break it down a little bit more, attack self and withdrawal will decrease from time 1 to time 2, and avoidance and attack other will increase from time 1 to time 2. So as you can see here, just kind of a little image to go along with that, attack self is higher at time 1, decreasing over time, along with withdrawal, whereas avoidance is lower at time 1, but increases over time, and the same with attack other. So the design, the setup of our study was our participants would arrive, and they'd be randomly assigned to either our control or inclusion group, or our experimental or exclusion group. We would have them then complete a self-profile. We would either tell them that they had been selected if they were in an inclusion condition, or that they had not been selected by the group for our exclusion condition. We would then give them the cost, which would be our measurement at time 1. We would set up a time for them to return, and when they came back, we would have them take the cost again, which would be our time 2 measurement, at which time we would also debrief them. So you can see here we're measuring across conditions at time 1 and time 2, as well as within conditions for our exclusion group and our inclusion group, giving a total of 4 analyses that we're conducting. So our cover story is that participants were told that we are interested in looking at team versus individual decision making. We'd hoped that this would distract the participant from the idea of being rejected, so a little bit of deception was needed for this. For our inclusion group, participants were asked to review 4 real profiles of other students and pick 3 people that they would prefer to work with. They were told that the others were also reviewing the profiles, and once all the profiles had been reviewed, I would inform them that they had been selected by the others to be a part of the team decision-making task. For our exclusion group, it was virtually the same setup, except that we had told them that they were not selected by the others, and that they would have to continue on the study with their individual decision-making task. So the profiles consisted of 4 mock students. The participants didn't know this. They also asked a few general entrance questions, as well as contained the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, just to kind of see if self-esteem could predict reactions on the cost, as well as to situations of rejection. So participants at time 1 and time 2, we had a total of 33 participants. We had 16 people in our inclusion and 17 people in our exclusion condition. 40% were male and 60% were female. And the average age was about 21, with a standard deviation of about 4, and the age ranged from 18 to 33. So the analysis of the results, first we did 2 independent sample t-tests were conducted to look at control versus our exclusion group at time 1, and control versus the exclusion group at time 2. 2 dependent sample t-tests were also conducted, looking at the exclusion group from time 1 to time 2, as well as our inclusion group from time 1 to time 2. So our expected results were that it would be higher at time 1 and decrease over time, and our observed results were kind of following that, but we didn't really find any significant results, but it did kind of match our hypothesis. For attack self, we expected that it would be higher at time 1 and decrease over time, and we kind of saw something along those lines. However, the change from time 1 to time 2 was trending towards significance. And the interesting finding that we have found so far is that if we break this category, this attack self, into high versus low self-esteem, people with low self-esteem who are rejected are scoring incredibly high on attack self. And a really interesting fact is if you break it down even further between males and females, low self-esteem females who are included are scoring significantly lower at attack self, which means they're feeling better about themselves for being included to a group. So that's actually a really impressive finding that we weren't expecting to see at all in our results. So, continue on, avoidance, we expected it to be lower at time 1 and higher at time 2. What we did find was it was much lower than our inclusion group at time 1, and it significantly increased over time. So you can see here that it's trending towards a significant difference at time 1, and we do actually have a significant difference from time 1 to time 2, suggesting that feelings of avoidance increase over time. Attack other is lower at time 1, or what we expected to see, was lower at time 1 and higher at time 2. And what we found that it was higher at time 1 and at time 2, and both of these were trending towards significance. So most of our hypotheses were supported, which was really cool to see. But an interesting finding was exclusion avoidance scores. This suggests that when we initially experience feelings of rejection, we can't avoid from them. They're so in our face that we can't hide, we can't blow it off, we can't say it doesn't really matter because it's so apparent in our first experience. So this suggests that we have to use the other coping methods at first, the attack self, the attack other, and the withdrawal, and then over time we are allowed to avoid the situation and eventually cope with it. The limitations of the study were sample size. It was expected that our research grant would kind of help with this, but unfortunately we didn't really get the sample size that we had been expecting. With low sample size comes low power, and some participants had actually did not believe that there were others in the study, so they were able to see through our deception, and the feelings of rejection weren't actually felt as bad as somebody who did believe that there were others in the study. So in conclusion, rejection is part of our everyday experience. Some of us are more sensitive to rejection than others and experience it more intensely. We cope with this in different ways. Some examples could be these individuals. Does anybody know who these are, any chance? This is Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. These were the shooters at Columbine High School. It is well documented that they were severely rejected by their peers, and they were not included in almost any form of social interaction. This individual, does anybody recognize him? This is William Cho from Virginia Tech, and it's also documented that he was rejected from his peers and classmates. And so you can kind of see from these the extreme cases of what rejection can have on society. So the big picture is that we can better recognize, or if we can better recognize, how people respond to rejection and how they cope with it over time, then we may be able to prevent future tragedies such as Columbine and Virginia Tech from happening. To do this, we may be better able to recognize individuals who are rejected and assess their coping style. If you have somebody who's scoring extremely high in withdrawal, they may not be facing their problems up front, so it might be a good idea to take them, maybe it's therapy or just some sort of mental health to try and get them to cope with their problems in a better way. Any questions?